I'm David Mayeux. Welcome to my theological reflection and presentation on The Long Loneliness, the autobiography of Dorothy Day. Day's autobiography, which was published in 1952 by Day's own hand, was not meant to be a historical or psychological biography in its nature, but was intended to be a spiritual autobiography in which she described where she found God in her life, her conversion to a faith in Jesus Christ, and how that faith was lived out in the Catholic Church and in its expression through the Catholic worker movement that she helped co-found. The book has a three-part structure covering her childhood life through young adulthood in the first part, her specific period of a common law marriage that she had in which she was genuinely in love, gave birth to a child, and after having that child baptized, came herself into the Catholic Church. And then her third part of her biography covers the co-founding of the Catholic worker movement for which Dorothy Day is known with Peter Morin, and covers the period from her meeting period with Morin until just after his death. In the first part, entitled Searching, Dorothy Day describes her childhood and young adulthood, most of which was absent from any particular religion. In fact, she ended up, as she joined college, rejecting religion as she had a deep love for the poor, born out of her childhood experience on the streets of Chicago and reading writers like Kropotkin, the anarchist Kropotkin, and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. But she found a certain hypocrisy in the Christian faith, that while it professed a love for the poor, it did not seem to live out that love beyond immediate charity. She felt like there was a need to lift up the impoverished out of their condition, and try to end slavery rather than just serve the slaves, as she described it. And so she began to look away from Christianity toward what she called other prophets, people like Kropotkin, Marx, Tolstoy, Trotsky, and groups like the Communist Party, which she joined in college, the Industrial Workers of the World, and other labor unions and organizers. And it was here that she first found that sense of community based on helping one another that she was searching for. And she herself became a journalist and began reporting on these very radical movements and these labor organizing that she was going on. However, as she had expressly or explicitly rejected religion, she was often attracted to religion as it was lived out simply among the very people that she was hoping to serve. She would see young mothers, heads bowed in prayer. She would see young women who made it a point to go to Mass before work began. And it was seeing these simple expressions of faith in the very people she was trying to serve that caused her to become attracted to this very faith. And so she began to have the first seeds or inklings of religious life within her, born not out of the social teachings of the church, as one might have expected, but out of these simple acts of faith. In part two, she describes the meeting of a young man, Forster Botterham, who shared the radical anarchist ideas that she did, and was very expressly and avowedly atheist. She entered into a common law marriage with Botterham, and they moved into a house on Staten Island, where they lived a life of extreme simplicity, poverty, but in which Day found real community in the people around her, and a real sense of peace and happiness, which she said had a sort of this double impact. On the other hand, she found a natural happiness, but it pointed her soul to this sort of transcendent idea of happiness, that there was something beyond the life she was living, and she began to pray more. This came to a head when she became pregnant with her daughter by Botterham, and she found herself reaching more and more toward God, not out of a sense of need, but out of a sense of happiness. And it was from this beauty of the life that she was living and the happiness that she was experiencing that she ended up truly coming to God. This natural happiness in Day's life came to an apex with the birth of her daughter Tamar. Um, and it also was the beginning of the end of her natural happiness, for she was convicted in her faith at this point that Tamar needed to be baptized. And after that baptism, Day herself found herself in need of becoming a member of the Catholic Church herself. She had chosen the Catholic Church in particular because of its connection with the masses. Most of the poor that she was serving were immigrants who brought their Catholic faith with them. And she found solidarity with them in their faith, which caused her to be drawn to the Catholic Church as a church of the people, which might be a little unexpected for someone that we would consider to be something of a radical, where we might think that they would try to find, something akin to spiritual but not religious. But for her, it was quite the opposite. Her identity with the people caused her to seek out the faith of the people, that is the Catholic Church, helped by writings such as the Imitation of Christ and the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Avila as well, whom she adored. And so she sought instruction in becoming Catholic, and she knew that this was going to be an unconquerable wedge between her and Forster. To become Catholic, for me, to give up a mate with whom I was very much in love. And so she had to make that decision that said whether she was going to have to choose God or man. And in the end, she chose God. She came into the church, and Forster left her and Tamar because of that decision to enter into the church. And so from the very beginning of her life, Dorothy Day experienced the cross in terms of that rejection that comes from embracing the faith, rejection by the world and persecution by the world for her faith in Christ. The the tension between her faith and the ideals that she had professed as a radical um, sort of put a curb to her happiness. But she knew that the church that she was a part of contained the truth, and so she was not willing to give it up, even though she saw it to be sort of a part of the very establishment that she was fighting against. And this tension for her was pretty terrible until she met Peter Morin. Peter Morin was a French peasant, born a French peasant, had become a philosopher, and very much on fire with his faith and with the teachings of the church as it concerned their social doctrine. And Peter and Dorothy met and saw in one another kindred spirits, united by their love of the poor and their faith, and really worked together to found what has become known as the Catholic Worker Movement. Peter Morin was the sort of the ideas man behind the Catholic Worker, while Dorothy Day was the one who would give reality and expression to those ideas. And his ultimate idea was that people, through faith and love of one another, the best way to live that out would be to return to the land, to primarily agrarian societies, in which they would produce their own to meet their own needs. And for those needs that could not be met on their own, they would be met by small owner-worker industries, or worker-owner industries that would meet those needs that could not be met, particularly farming the earth. But they also knew that this ideal could not be met by people, or to people as they were. The people would not embrace this idea. And so they came up with this program of roundtable discussions led by Peter, who would express his ideas, houses of hospitality where they would meet people in need where they were at, by providing them the basic needs. And then also what Peter called agronomic universities, which became the Catholic Worker Farms, which were places where Peter's ideas were lived out, where the experiment could become a reality. And the means by which they would promote this program would be the Catholic Worker newspaper that Morin and Day co-founded, and with which Day is probably most immediately associated with. So Day and Peter began to put into place the very programs that they were trying. Peter would give his roundtable discussions wherever they met, and they would hand out the Catholic worker on the street to espouse his ideas. They formed hospitality houses in the cities, which often served as bread lines and perhaps derogatorily flop houses. And they started founding individual Catholic worker farms throughout the country to put in place Peter Morin's ideas. As they made these ideas manifest in these works, they would often come under severe criticism from the church, though they also found many allies as well. And many saw them as sort of Catholic communists in disguise. They would recognize the piety and the faithfulness of members of the Catholic worker movement, but felt like what they were teaching was some way contrary to the very gospel that they claimed to profess. The Catholic movement's philosophies of worker ownership, the right to private property, the idea of rooted communitarianism, and even anarchy, which is the term they use, but perhaps now we would, better describe it as self-governance without a state, as opposed to a government. It would just be self-government. These ideas are espoused in the social encyclicals of the popes. They are the modern expression of the faith as the popes have taught it, just lived out. I think one key point of this, a lot of the economic and political theory could be described as distributism. In fact, Dorothy Day uses that very term to describe it. This is a philosophy espoused by G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, who are beloved by sort of the traditional conservative-minded Catholics. And I think if they could see the point of contact, there would be less conflict between Day and some of her contemporary critics. As I said before, the book ends with Peter Morin's death. After it's gone through to describe some of the successes and failures of the Catholic worker movement as Dorothy Day experienced it. But in the end, it was for her the expression of what she had been seeking for from the very beginning, like the creation of a community that served one another, especially the needs of the poor, from a place of kindness, and ultimately for her a place rooted in the gospel and the love of Christ. The title of the book, The Long Loneliness, is a theme explored throughout the book. And if we were going to give sort of a theological expression to this book, it would be the idea that the long loneliness is the restlessness that St. Augustine speaks to, that God, you have made us for yourselves, and we are restless until we rest in you. And the long loneliness is Day's expression of that, in which we recognize in our lives that in many ways we are alone because of original sin, that we have been severed from communion with God and from communion with one another. And the work of the Christian is, through the grace of the sacraments, to restore that communion of people with God and with one another. And so the long loneliness is something that drives us to God, but also as Day experienced it, like faith in God itself also perpetuates this long loneliness, because it often it runs contrary to the world. As Christ said, have faith in me and the world will hate you. So it both leads us to God, but also perpetuates something of our separateness from the world. But when we are driven by the sacraments and by faith in God, then we seek to restore communion. And this is exactly what Day and the Catholic worker movement were doing, to bring people together who had been separated from communion with one another by poverty, to share in primarily what she describes as the breaking of the bread with God in the Mass, and breaking of the bread in fellowship with one another in meals. And by these two ways, we will overcome the long loneliness that we know.